All right, welcome to the Sampling Handbook video tutorial series. My name is Marcus Huskins, and I'm a producer, mixer, engineer, and I'm just outside of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And in addition to doing some producing and mixing and anything that comes my way, I also have developed a line of sample libraries under the brand of badcatsamples.com. which is under my main company umbrella, which is Bad Cat Media Group. So first of all, I just wanted to say thanks for purchasing this series and thanks for purchasing this ebook. So obviously, if you're watching this video, you have purchased one of the tiers, either tier 2 or tier 3 that includes this video. So first of all, let me just give you a little rundown of how I kind of envision this working in my head. Basically, I wrote the ebook over about a year, maybe a little bit more than a year even. And I had initially, this ebook went through a lot of different formats, and I went through a lot of different editing. And initially, when I was planning the video series, I was really planning to do kind of a one-to-one. So I was going to do a bunch of short little videos that would just be relevant or pertinent to particular parts, like noise reduction, pre-processing, pitch correction, etc., etc. But to be honest with you, I'm actually redoing this entire video series because after this kind of came to completion, the book, and after I kind of reanalyzed the way that I work now as opposed to the way that I worked a year ago, I basically came to the conclusion that I wanted to approach this series in a slightly different way. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a look at different parts of this here, and I might not necessarily follow the order in terms of where I'm going. And in addition to that, I might actually, we might be going over something like editing or noise reduction, and then I might jump back and start talking about things like, recording levels or, things like that, preamp choice. So this isn't necessarily going to be a linear video course in terms of its format and following the book. But having said that, I think it's pretty important that before you watch this video course that you do read the book, because the book is incredibly detailed, and I went into a lot of detail on the actual process that I take when working. And this video series is going to make a lot more sense if you've actually read the book beforehand. Let's jump right in. And we're pretty much going to be picking up from somewhere around here. Okay, so we're going to be touching base on some of these things here, but we're going to be pretty much picking off with after the recording session. So pretty much just going to hop in right here. Okay, so let's have a look at, or let's have a discussion about what we're looking at right here. Okay, so this is a Pro Tools session. Now, this Pro Tools session is an exact copy of a recording session, exactly how my recording session would look in its raw format after I've done the sampling session. Now, one thing to make note of here is if I bring up my session settings over here, you'll notice here that this is set to a 48-bit sample rate. Now we're in 24-bit. The reason for this is just to keep things simple and just to keep things easy on the data side of things. I've made a copy of my original session, and I've converted this to 48K. So, but normally I always record everything, especially if I'm doing acoustic stuff, it's always recorded at 96K. And I'll do most of my work at 96K. But in this case, we're working in a 48K copy. Okay, let's just reference the manual really quickly here. We're going to start off, we're going to have a look at something along the lines of the recording levels, the session organization, the recording session, and then we're going to kind of taper into the chapter 2 here. So that's pretty much what we're going to be looking at first of all. All right, so let's come back over here. Okay, so like I mentioned, this is my session after I've done recording it. So let's just expand these tracks here for a second. The first thing you're going to notice is that we have the pitches on the left-hand side here. Before I did any recording, I've always named my tracks accordingly, because the last thing I want to have is something like audio 01 or audio 02 or anything like that. So what I'm doing is I'm finding out what pitches I'm sampling, and then I start naming my pitches accordingly. So in this case, we're looking at the Celtic harp. And the Celtic harp, well, actually we called it the Lucky harp, but we're looking at a Celtic harp tracking session. So the first pitch we have here is C3. And then if we go all the way down to the bottom here, we're going all the way up to G6. So from C3 to G6. Now you'll notice that the way I lay this out here is in a very linear fashion, both vertically and horizontally. So this is mainly for organizational purposes. So what I like to do is I like to start off with my lowest pitch being the first track that I record, and then I will move up in terms of my pitches. I'll move up as I'm going through. I'll move up these tracks here, depending on the pitches of the instrument, and then I'll end up on my highest pitch. So lowest to highest from track 1 all the way down to track 26 here, as we can see. Now I've done some basic color coding here that just allows me to differentiate the different octaves between each other. Now you don't have to do this. This is just simply visual, but it's something that I like to do. Okay, now we're going to have a quick look at the way that this is laid out here. So for example, if we take F3 as an example, I'm just going to stretch this vertically and horizontally. We'll zoom that as well. You can see here that we have these different sets of transients, these different sets of samples, these waveforms over here. See these ones in between here? These are my actual velocity layers over here. So anything that's residing in between these other parts over here. So this, for example, would be my velocity layer 1. And then as we move up, this would be my velocity layer 2. This would be my velocity layer 3 samples. This would be my velocity layer 4 samples. This would be my velocity layer 5 samples over here. And then everything from here right to the end, that's going to be all my velocity layer 6 samples. If you read the book, there's one thing that you may have remembered that I wrote down there, which is that I always like to have the composer give me a verbal cue in between the sets of velocity layers. So this is something that I always like to do. For example, this part over here, this would be the artist that I'm recording, not necessarily composer, sorry, the artist. This would be them giving me a verbal cue of some sort. So if I zoomed in here, my guess would be maybe somewhere about here, from starting here.
No, I don't think so.
So maybe here. Yeah, I don't think so. Okay, thanks. Okay, so from here, maybe actually it's back here.
Velocity layer 2?
So there's my velocity layer 2 cue, right? In the very beginning, my velocity layer 1 cue will be happening.
Velocity layer 1?
This will be my velocity layer 3 key right over here.
Velocity layer number 3?
And so on and so forth. So over here would be my number 4. No, this would be number 5.
5.
And then our last one would be 6 here.
Velocity layer 6?
And then if we go back to the very beginning, you'll also notice that he will most likely say the pitch, because that's what I usually ask.
Velocity layer 1, F3.
So I have a verbal cue in front of everything. Now, another important thing which I like to do is, if you notice at the very beginning of all of these files over here, let me just do a zoom so we can see a little bit more information. I'm going to zoom in here. You'll notice that there's a blank space at the very beginning of each one of these files. And the reason for that is because I like to take a noise profile, or otherwise known as room tone. And this is going to come in handy when we start doing some noise reduction on our samples, which is something that I do on all of my libraries. So if I take any pitch here, I could zero in on this over here, and let's just take actually from here to there. And let's just view that in full screen. You'll notice here that we just have what looks to be like blank space, but if we solo this out and play it, okay, that's just a little bit of a fingerprint. And what that's going to allow me to do is that's going to allow me to take a noise profile when I start doing my work. Now, I do this on every single sample, but if you're actually recording in one shot, you don't necessarily need to do this on every single sample. This is just something that I do because I'll usually do a really quick cross-reference to check to see if my noise profiles are changing, or whether they've changed, or maybe something was on in the background and maybe I have to treat a sample differently. But either way, having that little bit of noise in the very front end of the sample, and hopefully having enough of it that we don't have any chairs knocking or anything like that, is a really, really good way to tackle this. All right. So that's the basic format that I like to use when I'm recording. And I will set this up ahead of time before the sampling session even occurs. I will have already created my session. I will have made sure that my inputs on all my tracks are set accordingly. For this particular sample tracking session, I was using my Apogee Ensemble, and I was using the Ensemble 2 preamp. And so I had that set up for every single sample. And I basically went ahead and named these samples ahead of time and did some basic color coding so that as we were moving along through the tracking session, I didn't have to say to the artist who was in the booth, okay, hold on a second, I got to create a new track, I got to create a new name. This is something that was already created ahead of time, and it was very simple for me to just pull up and get to work when we had time to go on the tracking session. Okay, so one other thing that I want to talk about before we move on here is you'll notice up here I have all these sends. So in Pro Tools, this is our sends can be sent out to an aux track or something like that. So I have a mono aux track, which is very similar to Studio One or Cubase, or Logic terminology would be similar to a bus. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm sending all of these out here to send A, and they're all going out at unity gain. And the purpose of this is because I actually have a tuner that I'm putting on this aux track over here. I've got the track itself muted and the fader's pulled down, but visually we have this tuner here. And what this is allowing me to do is, just as a reference while we're tracking, and also later for the editing session, I'm able to really, really quickly check to make sure that our tuning is in spec. When I'm doing any recording and when I'm working with an artist, I always have them with a tuner on board the instrument or some type of tuner in there. And it's usually a high quality one. I like to use a Shark tuner, which is incredibly accurate. And I'm usually doing, tuning passes in between my takes and stuff like that to make sure that we're tracking in tune. Because the end goal whenever I'm recording something is I want to have to do as little as possible when it comes time to doing things like pitch correction. I don't want to have to do any of that really. And if I do, I just want to have to maybe just do a little bit, but I definitely don't want to have stuff that's way, way off. And then I also have a tolerance that I set personally where I allow a little bit of deviation, plus or minus a couple cents one way or the other, so that this instrument will still have a little bit of a natural sound. Okay, so that's how I set up my Pro Tools session here. Like we said, we have our sends going out. We're using just one bus so we can keep the CPU resources down to a minimum. I've got an auxiliary track that's pulled up here. I've got a tuner plugin set on here so that I can keep an eye on this while I'm tuning. Now, the last thing that I have here, which I want to talk about, is I have this BX meter, which I just happen to think is a really good all-purpose meter. And it's really, really simple meter, and this just helps me with my levels. So when I'm setting my levels for my tracking session, let's hop back over to a track over here. We will use F3 as an example. And let's just go like this for a second. I can actually set my levels while I'm monitoring what's coming out of the main mix over here. I can set my levels accordingly. So for instance, here would be, some louder stuff that's happening on the velocity layer 6 of this sample library. So I get lots of information here. I get my peak, and if it's an instrument that has RMS content that I have to monitor, such as the Performer chord, one of the instruments that we did, I can also monitor the RMS and make sure that I'm hitting everything in the sweet spot. So here's a louder one. So that's about the loudest we have over here. This one might be slightly louder. No, not by much. I can reset this. Okay, so 9.2. So at about the loudest, we're hitting about 9.2. So that's pretty good. At the lowest, we're hitting really low. So just keep your eye on this. It'll be extremely low. So, I mean, we're peaking down here. Our RMS is barely tickling the needle. But there's a purpose for this. The reason being that I wanted this to be an incredibly dynamic and an incredibly deeply sampled and realistic harp instrument. So here's our second velocity layer. Right, that's a little bit louder. Here's our third. A little bit louder yet. There's our fourth. Here's our fifth. And then again, the loudest being our sixth, which is really loud. So this is a meter that I like to use over here. I really like this meter. It's really simple. BrainWorks BX meter. And you know, it was available as under another name at another time, but I just find this is a really nice, simple meter to be able to use while tracking because it handles the peak and the RMS so well. Okay, so that's a basic overview of my tracking session. Now here you'll see that I just have a talkback mic that was routed to my talent, which was in a vocal booth or in a booth. And then I have a talkback mic coming back from my talent, which I would usually have another microphone set up to so that they can speak back to me. Or sometimes I'll just use the main mic that we have record enabled so that we can hear each other and communicate. Now, lastly, before I head over to the next video, I just want to bring up something here. You may have noticed that I have this instrument track in here, and I just have a very simple mini grand piano loaded up here. Now, there's a reason for this, is because sometimes when you're tuning, sometimes you have certain pitches that are just, they might be hard to get an accurate tuning on in terms of, running off of a tuning meter of some sort. So what I often do is I will have just a basic piano plugin of some sort, something to A440. This is a perfect example. This is a mini grand piano, comes with the Air Instruments bundle and Pro Tools. And I'll just record enable this. And if we head to that same F pitch, I can very quickly play a note. If the person's having trouble tuning, we can reference a piano at different octaves. So this is just something that I have in my recording template. And to be honest with you, I also leave it in my editing templates, as sometimes when I'm trying to make some decisions as to what I need to pitch correct, I will often reference a piano instrument, a piano VST, such as this. If I'm really not sure if I need to tune something, I'll play it against different octaves of the pitch just to kind of make a decision as to whether I can leave it or whether I feel that it needs to be adjusted. So that's just a little tip for you there. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to have a little bit of a deeper look here underneath the hood. And we're going to make the assumption that we've created the tracking session, which is where we are now. And then what I like to do is I like to take the tracking session and basically export myself all of these raw regions. And then I will often, sometimes I will set this up as I will leave the tracking session completely alone, so I have access to my raw originals unaltered. And other times, depending on how much of a rush I'm in, or depending on whether I even just forgot about it or started to work too quickly, I will sometimes go ahead and start doing the first steps of my editing or my processing that's going to happen before my editing. I will actually do it in the tracking session sometimes. Okay, so we're going to see you in the next video. Thanks.